All right, so like I said, I'm going to start with the non-GMO project verification program. So you may recognize the non-GMO project by the butterfly logo, is what we like to call it. So really the non-GMO project right now has about 43,000 verified products. We've got about 3,000 participants for participating brands. And so probably the most recognized program right now for non-GMO. The non-GMO project has four main pillars to compliance, and that includes compliant inputs, traceability, segregation and clean out, and testing for high-risk inputs. So now we'll get into the requirements for verifying your product and classifying your ingredients. So the non-GMO project formula evaluation is based on the percentage of ingredients by weight, excluding added water and salt in the finished product. Processing aids are excluded from the formula calculations if the processing aid is less than 0.5% in the finished product and it's not listed on the ingredient panel. So if a processing aid is on the ingredient panel, then it does need to be included in the scope of review and the calculation. The ingredients for the non-GMO project evaluation are evaluated on two different levels, by risk level and by classification. So the classifications are based on the percentage in the finished product. The major ingredients are going to be ingredients that are more than 5%. If they're less than 5% but greater than 0.5%, that's called a minor, and anything less than 0.5% is a micro. And so there's different requirements for each of those ingredients depending on the risk level. So if they're non-risk or low-risk ingredients, then pretty much the documentation is similar. But where the percentages come into play is if the ingredient is classified as a high-risk ingredient, and different compliance documentation is required at those levels. The non-GMO project also has a special defining ingredients clause, and that means if a product has a name of an ingredient in the name, then that becomes a defining ingredient, and those ingredients must be treated as a major ingredient regardless of the actual percentage in the product. So again, the risk levels are high, there's low risk or monitored risk, and non-risk, and we'll get into those real quick. The non-risk inputs for the non-GMO project are materials that are not derived from biological organisms and are therefore not susceptible to genetic modification. So we're talking about minerals, salt, baking soda. Low-risk ingredients are ingredients that are derived from biological organisms, but they're not commercially available in a GM form. And the monitored list are GM organisms that may be in research and development stages, but at this time they're not commercially available. So these two are kind of treated the same for low risk and monitored risk. We have to just confirm that they do fit into that status and there are no high risk sub-ingredients. High-risk inputs are going to be inputs for which genetically modified versions are widely commercially available. So you know the list, it's corn, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, cotton, soy, papaya, summer squash, and zucchini. And the high-risk ingredients also includes anything that's derived from those high-risk crops, and it also includes animal-derived ingredients, butter, cream, honey, etc. So here's just a quick look. So you would ask yourself, are any of your ingredients high-risk or derivatives of high-risk ingredients? And there's the list I just mentioned of the high-risk crop. To give you an idea of some of the derivatives, we're talking about molasses, maltodextrins, corn syrup, maybe a citric acid that's derived from a glucose syrup that was from sugar beet. Other derivatives that are high risk that are going to be pertinent to baked goods probably are yeast products, vitamins that may be in a flour for enrichment, flavorings. And then there's a category of non-testable high-risk ingredients. These are ingredients that you couldn't necessarily test for genetically modified sequences, and so these are confirmed through affidavits, and that's going to include enzymes, microbial starters, which includes yeast, and we'll get into the specifics of how to demonstrate compliance for those. And then synthetic biology is another classification for high-risk ingredients. So what's really required to demonstrate compliance for these ingredients? So for non-risk ingredients for the non-GMO project verification, the only thing you need to submit is a specification sheet that has an ingredient declaration. And this is to confirm that that ingredient really is non-risk. There's no high-risk sub-ingredients. That's pretty simple. For anything that's already non-GMO project verified, we just need to get the specification sheet to show which product you're using in your formulas. We get the non-GMO certificate of compliance, their summary or their web listing of the product that's verified, and then we'll get proof of purchase, either if you're purchasing it now or if you plan to purchase it, you can confirm that you'll submit that. For low risk or monitored risk, we'll just look at the documentation to show the full ingredient composition, so we can confirm that it is just low risk. So for example, a wheat flour, just wheat flour, that's going to be low risk or monitored risk. And then we also need to get documentation from your supplier that they have basically a third-party food safety audit certificate that shows they have some systems in place to avoid cross-contamination with GM materials, so traceability and segregation. And then high-risk ingredients, again, these are going to be evaluated based on a percentage in the product, and this is where the compliance documentation differs depending on the percentage. So for high-risk inputs that are less than 0.5%, they may be exempt from evaluation as long as you only take a total exemption per formula of 0.9%. Things that can be exempt would be if you have a bit of soy oil, soy lecithin, really anything can be exempt if it's less than 0.5%, as long as it's not a viable microbe, a functional enzyme, or product of synthetic biology. So I know that enzymes are used a lot in the bread baking world, and if you can demonstrate that the enzyme is no longer functional in the finished product due to high heat, then those can be exempt because they're no longer functional enzymes. And then for ingredients that are high risk and they are less than 5% but more than 0.5%, we'll need to get the full ingredient composition, and then we have to demonstrate that that ingredient comes from a system designed to avoid GMO. So something like an organic certificate or a third-party non-GMO identity preservation system will be sufficient to demonstrate that. So for example, if you're using a soybean oil and it's organic, it's less than 5%, then that's sufficient to demonstrate that. That also is the same for honey, anything that's really high risk. Organic certificate is sufficient for compliance to anything less than 5%. And then if a high-risk ingredient is in your product at greater than or more than 5%, greater than or equal to 5%, then this is where the sampling and testing comes in. So we look at the full ingredient composition. Sampling and testing is required. And of course, sampling and testing has to be done on the source material or the ingredient that has intact DNA. So this can be challenging if you do have to go back to the source or testing if it's been highly processed. Another pathway for compliance for ingredients that are high risk and more than 5%, there is a pathway to downgrade the ingredient. And this means that the ingredient has come from a country where GMOs are not allowed to be cultivated, and they can demonstrate that they're not importing from other countries. And again, if the ingredient is non-GMO project verified, then we just need that certificate of compliance, proof of purchase, and the summary or web listing. So high-risk ingredients that are more than 5% and animal ingredients, you may be wondering, when are those required to be tested? As I mentioned, high-risk inputs more than 5%. For food products, they must be PCR tested and meet action thresholds for GM content. So if they're non-GMO project verified already, that means the manufacturer has already taken this step and you'd only need to submit their certificate. For animal-derived ingredients, we must look at the feed rations for those animals. And if anything is in their feed ration at greater than 5%, then sampling and testing is required for those components. If it can be demonstrated that they're actually fed low-risk ingredients like grass from New Zealand, then that can be sufficient for compliance. And for honey, if it's not organic, then we need to show that the bee's forage area must be sufficiently free of commercially available GM agricultural within a 4-mile radius of the hive. And we also look at supplemental feed. So with honey, if honey is organic and it's more than 5%, there's an affidavit that can be signed with the organic certifying body that confirms that the NOP suggested regulations for honey compliance have been followed. And so that's another pathway. So honey at greater than 5% needs to be non-GMO project verified. You need to be able to show that either it's organic and the organic certifier confirms that, or then the other option is to show that the hives are located in an area where GM agriculture is not present. Another pathway for the compliance for major high-risk ingredients, or really any high-risk ingredient, is to show that it comes from a country where GM crops are not cultivated. So if you can show that and say, hey, this comes from a country where they have strict GM regulations and we're not importing from the US or another country that is growing GM crops, then it can be downgraded to a low-risk ingredient, and then you'll just need to submit the specification sheet and the downgrade affidavit. So for facility requirements for the non-GMO project verification, we're looking at traceability, segregation, and clean out. So these are really core components of any GFSI certified food safety scheme. So we'll get information about that, or if your facility is organic, an organic certificate can be submitted to show that, and there's a small compliance plan that we get for that. An on-site inspection can be required at the facility, and they're not always required. If there's parallel processing at the facility, that will trigger an inspection. Parallel processing for the non-GMO project is if you have a high-risk ingredient in your formula at greater than 5%, and in that same facility, you have a non-GMO project compliant and a non-GMO project not compliant version of that specific ingredient, that triggers an inspection. And one of our third-party auditors will make a visit to your facility and just make sure what you've told us on paper is what's happening at the facility. So they'll walk through the facility, they'll look at the efficacy of your compliance plan, they do a traceback and mass balance exercise to confirm that. So that was a good rush through that. And now I'm going to turn things over to Jessica. She'll get into the details of the non-GMO, the NSF Non-GMO True North program.
All right, thanks, Marcy. So since this seems like this might be y'all's first kind of introduction to True North, we're going to kind of go a little bit slower and kind of take our time and kind of sift through what True North is all about. So True North was created to assure the integrity of GMO claims and to grow the breadth and diversity of non-GMO verified products sold at retail, as well as non-GMO certified ingredients sold throughout the supply chain. True North will incorporate elements from the EU labeling requirements, and True North pulls best practice from commonly used leading food safety standards in the evaluation of the process. And that'll come into play in just a little bit when we look at facilities. The basic tenets of the True North program, they're consistent with other compliance verification programs such as segregation, traceability, supplier approval, testing, non-conformance, etc. The format for True North is slightly different than others. True North is divided into two parts. You have the True North general requirements and you have the annexes. Currently, there are 6 annexes, A, B, C, D, and H and I. For y'all, for Bimbo, y'all would be under Annex C, consumer packaged goods for human and pet foods. Examples of our other annexes are dietary supplements and livestock feed, and Annex B, which would be livestock and animal products, which you'll want to keep tabs on that one because that one may or may not be applicable to you all. In January of 2018, True North launched Annex H, which is our cosmetic, personal care, and household cleaning. And then we also launched Annex I, which is fiber and textiles. So let's start diving into some of the specifics, requirements as it relates to ingredients, as well as the supply chain. And please let me know if I'm going too fast or I'm speaking too fast. So with True North, applicants must demonstrate the effective implementation of procedures which control the integrity of the product, as well as the process by preventing deviations from the True North compliant formulas and procedures. So that's very similar. This includes, but is not limited to, supplier and raw material approval, monitoring, controls and product development, and launch procedures, sanitation and segregation controls, documented operating procedures, and the like. While this may sound daunting, if the facility has a HACCP plan or is certified to a GFSI food safety standard like BRC or SQF or other similar third-party certifications, or if the facility is certified organic, then your operation more than likely has these procedures in place. And what True North is trying to do is to build upon those procedures or find ways to incorporate True North within those procedures. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. So let's continue on and let's understand the ingredients in the context of the True North certification. So raw materials and the inputs used in livestock feed or finished consumer products are classified as exempt, low risk, and high risk. The extent of documentation needed will depend on the risk category. Now, these categories will differ from the terminology that Marcy just used when talking about the non-GMO project verification. So let's break that down. So for a high-risk input, there are three different categories that comprise a high-risk input. First, an input is considered high risk if it's a seed crop or input for which a GE variety is commercialized, such as corn, soy, cotton, canola, papaya, sugar beets, summer squash, zucchini, and alfalfa, as well as animal-derived ingredients such as milk, butter, cheese, and honey. Second, a verified non-GMO variety of a high-risk input is still considered high risk if it originates from a facility that is engaged in parallel production and that supplier does not have controls in place to prevent commingling. Third, products of new GE technologies which are undetectable by current available test methods are considered high risk and not permitted unless proven non-GE. For example, ingredients that are artificially synthesized biologically. Operations must submit evidence of compliance for these high-risk ingredients, and we'll talk about those supplier documentation in just a couple slides. So a low-risk material is a high-risk material that originates from a dedicated operation certified to a non-GMO control program or equivalent, such as organic or another non-GMO IP. All right, so exempt ingredients. This is everybody's favorite. So there are many instances where an input can qualify for an exemption or may qualify for an exemption. For example, enzymes in food and feed, but there is some additional qualification if it's a dietary supplement, which really is not going to apply for you all. Processing aids not present in the finished product, and we would just need documentation to show that it's not present in the finished product and how it's not. Fermentation growth media for microbial products, provided that the input is an additive or a food ingredient. Non-viable inactivated microbes and their products in the food and feed, and again, there's some additional qualifications if the product's a dietary supplement. Mined minerals, and excluding chelated minerals. Vitamins in food and feed. Seeds, crops, and inputs not available in a GM form, such as strawberries, ryegrass, palm oil, and other non-high-risk commodities. Ingredients that are certified organic only need to be accompanied by the ingredient certificate, organic certificate and summary. And if the input is less than 0.9% of the total formulation. Now, I'm going to kind of break this down a little bit here. So as Marcy mentioned, there are some classifications, 5%, 0.5 to 5%, and less than 0.5. For True North, a major would be considered anything above 0.9%, and a minor would be considered anything less than 0.9%. However, there's a caveat. This 0.9% tolerance may be assessed either individually or if more than one potentially high-risk ingredient or sub-ingredient is present in that finished product formulation, then that 0.9% tolerance is assessed as an aggregate per finished product formula. So in other words, the limit is the combined weight of individual unverified high-risk ingredients not to exceed 0.9%. And then just keep in mind that with True North, formulations do include water and salt. So some examples of inputs that may be assessed and counted towards that 0.9% tolerance could include GE ingredients unavoidable due to commercial availability reasons, ingredients derived from high-risk commodity, products derived from a GM microbe, and carriers, solvents, etc., dextrins, starches, excipients, and the like, as well as an input that is artificially synthesized biologically. So as mentioned a few moments ago, True North is divided into annexes, where each annex does have to comply with the general requirements, and Annex C would be most applicable to the Bimbo line. Alrighty, so required forms. So listed here are the required forms that a facility must complete as part of their initial application package. These forms are where the operation will record important information on their operations, activities, and procedures. Some forms will ask to also supply additional documents or records, which will help us understand the facility's processes, and it will also serve as proof that you have implemented certain procedures. These give us like a big picture or a map of your operation. But keep in mind, if you are required to show documentation for like an animal-derived ingredient, you would also need to abide by, like, for example, Annex B. Well, again, we'll kind of talk about that, and your certification project manager will help you navigate through that as well. Alrighty, so you may be asking yourself, well, what supplier documentation do I need? So let's start off by noting that if an ingredient is certified organic, it is included in the exempt category, as long as you just submit the current organic certificate and summary listing for that input. Organic inputs are fully compliant at any level. So your organic milk can be present at 50% in your product formulation, as long as you provide the organic certificate and summary for that milk. That's all we would need. Like I said, additional testing would not be required. If the input or ingredient is certified to another non-GMO certification scheme, then just submit that certificate and we'll review it and may qualify and work in the same way as an organic certificate. So even True North will request supplier documentation to confirm that an ingredient is either A, qualifies for an exemption, or B, to confirm that an ingredient, if it's determined to be high risk, complies with the protocol. So I want to kind of touch base on some key attributes of a supplier document, because this sometimes will be a barrier. So the document should list each and every component used in that ingredient. These components we refer to as sub-ingredients and can include but are not limited to things like dextrins, flavors, extracts, etc. The document should list the percentage composition of these sub-ingredients, and we use this information to help us determine that 0.9% tolerance to make sure we're not exceeding it. And then the document should also list the raw source materials for that sub-ingredients. For example, maltodextrin. It could be from corn or tapioca. Tapioca would be exempt because it's not commercially available in a GM form. But if the supplier document didn't state that, then we would ask you to get additional information from your supplier. So we can't say equivocally that if you submitted all of these information, then no further documents would be requested. But what I can say is that if you give us at least these 3 things, it is a great place to start. So let's kind of put these into perspective, and let's look at what options True North has to confirm an input's compliance to the protocol. So this slide provides examples of options provided that the input did not qualify for the 0.9% per product threshold. So, for example, if your product formulation had corn flour present at 3%, it would not qualify for the 0.9, so it would have to demonstrate compliance another way. So one way may be that the corn flour is certified organic or verified through the Non-GMO project, in which case you would just submit the corn flour's organic certificate and summary, or the NGP certificate and web listing. Another option may be that the corn flour will need to be sampled and tested, in which case you would need to submit the sampling and testing plan as laid out in Section 5 of the general requirements, and submit test results, ensuring that the tested sample has sufficient intact DNA. And yet, another option could be that the corn originates from a country that prohibits cultivation of GM crops. So another example could include animal-derived ingredients such as milk, butter, honey. Again, assuming that these inputs didn't qualify for the 0.9% per product threshold. So a milk present at 15% of a finished product has options similar to a high-risk crop. If the milk is certified organic or non-GMO project verified, then the only documents that we would need would be the certificate and summary or web listing, and the feed would not be assessed. However, if the milk is not certified to a non-GMO IP system, then the animal's feed ration and compliance to the life cycle feeding requirements would be assessed. So this is where Annex B comes into play. So you would have to make sure that the milk complies with Annex B, which is we would look at the feed ration and assess any feed greater than 5% that's high risk. So the cow may be eating, grazing on Bermuda grass. That's exempt, not commercially available in GM, so we don't. That's cool. But maybe the cow is getting some soybean meal at, let's say, 10% of its ration. Then we would have to assess that soybean meal for compliance to Annex B. And again, it might be sampling and testing, country of origin, etc. Now let's kind of move on to honey. So for honey, if the honey was not certified organic or non-GMO project verified, then True North requires that the forage zone of the bees and supplement feed be assessed. Now the True North forage zone is a 1.8 mile radius. So we would need to see what kind of agriculture is happening within that 1.8 mile radius. And then again, if it was certified organic honey or non-GMO project honey, all we would need would be the certificate and summary, and then that's it. All right. Facility requirements. So Annex C refers to those operators who produce, manufacture, or handle products for human or pet consumption. And as I mentioned many times so far in our little abbreviated webinar here, the True North operates utilizing the requirements of the True North general requirements as the base, with industry-specific elements added on, and that's where those annexes come in. Those annexes are those industry-specific elements that are added on to the general requirements. However, with Annex C, there isn't any additional specific industry requirements in terms of the facility. So as long as your facility is meeting all the points listed in the general requirements, traceability, segregation, etc., then that's all we would need. When you submit your application package, should you elect to go the True North route, you will want to submit your facility's third-party certification, again, BRC, SQF, organic, etc. These certificates associated with those facilities may be used to fulfill many of the requirements outlined in Section 5 of the True North General Requirements. But at the end of the day, what we're looking for is that you demonstrate to NSF that the facility has incorporated these non-GMO concerns into your existing procedures. So a good example would be if the facility has a IP protocol in place for, let's say, gluten-free or allergen management program, etc. We would want True North to be slotted in with those procedures that you're already doing for, like I said, maybe for your allergen management program. So an on-site inspection. NSF will determine the need for an inspection based on risk factors because True North is a risk-based risk assessment protocol. First, we will identify if your facility is dedicated to True North production. If so, then no inspection required. Second, we will then assess if your facility is certified to an approved third-party IP system. And if your facility is not dedicated, so I apologize, I'm getting ahead of myself here. If your facility is certified to that approved third-party IP system, then no inspection will be required. Now, if your facility is not dedicated or is not certified to a third-party approved certification scheme, then we will assess where there is parallel processing of high-risk inputs or processing certified True North products and non-certified True North products. So if parallel processing is identified, this actually does not automatically qualify the facility to receive an on-site inspection. It just ensures that we dig a little bit deeper. So if parallel processing is identified, then we will request additional SOPs as well as an internal audit program that specifically demonstrates that identification and control measures of non-GMO risk have been identified and mitigation procedures have been created and implemented. Should a facility not be able to demonstrate an internal audit program or appropriate SOPs, then an on-site inspection may be warranted. So just kind of a quick note here, parallel processing is defined as the dual manufacturing of a single facility where shared equipment is used to process certified and non-certified products, and where non-certified high-risk inputs are used on that shared equipment. If you are lucky enough to have an on-site inspection, you can expect a facility walkthrough to verify suppliers and receiving procedures, traceability exercises, verification of cleaning and sanitation procedures, as well as collecting a sample if a sample is required. A good example would be if we were to inspect a farm. I know y'all aren't farms, but just kind of giving an example here. If we were to inspect a dairy plant that's seeking True North verification, then we would request a sample, and while during the on-site inspection, we would collect a sample of one of the feed.
Great, thanks, Jessica. So that's a good, nice overview of both of the non-GMO programs. So now we want to get into some specific examples that may be useful to help you understand what the differences would be for your products. So when we go through this, I will tell you about the non-GMO project requirements for the specific ingredients, and Jessica will touch on the True North requirements. So baking soda and salt. For the non-GMO project, we would only need a specification sheet that again confirms that it is a non-risk status. There's no high-risk sub-ingredient.
And again, for True North, even though baking soda and salts may qualify for an exemption. We would just need a specification sheet or some sort of supplier document just to confirm that.
And for flour blends for the non-GMO project, what we're going to get is documentation that gives the full ingredient composition. So if it's just wheat, that's going to be considered the low risk or monitored risk. If there are any high risk sub-ingredients, so let's say it's a flour blend that's got some cornmeal in there, then we need to get a document that shows the percent breakdown of that ingredient, or at least discloses the percentage of the high risk ingredient. And then compliance for this ingredient would be getting the information for that high risk sub-ingredient. So for the high risk corn, if it's more than 5% of your product, then we need to go down the sampling and testing or the NGP verified or downgrade route. Less than 5%, we would get the organic certificate or something that shows it comes from a system designed to avoid GMOs. And if it's less than 0.5% of that blend, then we can exempt that and just move forward with the full ingredient documentation for the flour blend.
And similar to True North, we would request a full ingredient document, specification sheet, etc., just to confirm what's inside of that blend. If there's anything high risk, I'll continue using Marcy soy. So if the soy is present at less than 0.9 and it's compliant to the 0.9 threshold, then that's all we would need. If it's present at above 0.9%, then we would need documentation to confirm this compliance, such as sampling and testing, maybe that soy is certified organic, or maybe that soy comes from a country that prohibits GM cultivation.
Okay, great. So for flavors for the non-GMO project, they're classified as high risk, and that's due to them often having carriers or high-risk sub-ingredients. And also we need to confirm that the flavor component itself is not derived from synthetic biology. So what we get for that is a full ingredient declaration form. We'll often need the percent breakdown of the ingredient. And then again, we'll classify each high-risk sub-ingredient based on the percentage of the finished product. If the flavor is less than 5% and it's organic, then that's going to be compliant, and all we'll need is the organic certificate and summary.
And again, similar to True North, if the overall flavor is certified organic or certified to the non-GMO project or to another non-GMO IP, then we would just need that certificate. Otherwise, we will need the full ingredient breakdown, again, confirming source information. True North has an input supplier affidavit that you can have your suppliers fill out, and it'll ask questions about the synthetic biology nature, about the derivatives of the various components. And again, we would assess to see if any of those sub-ingredients qualify to the 0.9% threshold. If not, and again, we would just need those sub-ingredients to comply with the True North requirements, such as sampling or testing, or certified to another non-GMO IP system.
And then for enzymes with the non-GMO project, we need to get documentation to confirm the GM status of the production microbe. So if the production microbe is non-GMO, then the enzyme is considered low risk and nothing more is needed. But if that microbe is sourced from a GM production microorganism, then it's not allowed in the product unless it's 0.5% of the finished product and not functional in the finished product. So again, having a statement that the high heat has denatured the enzyme would be sufficient to have that be compliant. If it's greater than 0.5% and it's from a genetically modified source, then it's not allowed in the non-GMO project formulas.
So enzymes are exempt from review for food and pet food products. There are some additional qualifications for dietary supplements or for cosmetic, personal care, etc.
Now, cultured wheat, we know that's sometimes common in baked goods. So again, we'll get the full ingredient declaration for non-GMO project verification. We want to confirm the GM status of the microbe used. And if the source is GM and it's less than 0.5%, it's not viable in the finished product, that can be exempt. If the microbe is GM and viable, then it's not allowed in the verified product. If that microbe was non-GM, from a non-GM source, it's going to be considered low risk, wheat's low risk, and then we would just get the supplier documentation for the facility.
For True North, we would just need to know if the microbe is viable or inactive in the finished product and how, just, is it, again, heat, etc. But if it is viable or active in the finished product, we just need to know the GM status of that microbe, if it's confirmed to be non-GMO, and we have a affidavit form that you can provide to your suppliers. If it's confirmed non-GMO, we're good to go. If it's GM and it's viable, then it would not be allowed.
Okay, so fermentation ingredients, so yeast. So for a yeast in a finished product or used in a bread, we need the full ingredient declaration. So this includes the GM status of the yeast strain or the microbe, and we also evaluate the fermentation media. So if the fermentation media is evaluated at the same level as the fermentation ingredient. So if you have yeast, it's more than 5% in your product, the fermentation media is also evaluated at 5%. So we're going to have to get documentation that discloses that. So if it's from sugarcane molasses, that's going to be low risk, and the yeast strain is non-GMO, then that would be compliant. But if the fermentation media was a sugar beet molasses, then we need to get information that shows that either that sugar beets have been tested or the sugar beets are from a country that do not allow cultivation of GM sugar beets. And the yeast strain would need to be non-GMO. If the yeast is less than 0.5%, the fermentation media would be exempt. And if you're using a non-GMO project verified yeast, then all you need to do is provide the specification sheet and provide the non-GMO certificate of compliance.
For True North, fermentation inputs, the fermentation media is exempt from review for additives and food ingredients. It is not exempt from review for fermented foods as if the vinegar itself was seeking verification, not if the vinegar was an ingredient. So that's the big takeaway.
So animal derivatives for the non-GMO project, again, we're going to need to get, this is for animal dairy. So full ingredient declarations, if it's more than 5% in your product, then we're going to have to either get a non-GMO project verified version of that ingredient, or we have to go down and look at the feed ration for the dairy animals and do testing for anything that's high risk and greater than 5% of that feed ration. Strip testing is allowed for that. If the dairy ingredient is less than 0.5%, then an organic certificate is sufficient because we know that system looks at the animal feed, or any other non-GM IP that specifically looks at the animal feed would work. If that's not available, then sampling and testing for the feed ration is required. If it's less than 0.5%, then it can be exempt from the evaluation.
And it's very similar to True North with the exception of if let's say the milk is present at 0.9% or more, then you could submit a organic certificate or a non-GMO IP certification for that milk. Now, if it's not certified to anything like that, then we will assess the high-risk feed within that animal's ration, and we will ask for sampling or testing of that feed, or we will ask to confirm where that feed originates from in terms of a country of origin. But if that milk, let's say that milk is present at 0.3% of the finished product formula, then it could qualify for the 0.9% exemption threshold.
And now talking about animal derivatives from bees, bee being the animal, we're talking honey. Then for the non-GMO project compliance, we need the full ingredient declaration, so it says 100% honey. And then we'll need to get, if it's greater than 5%, the pathway is going to be either the affidavit from the organic certifier to confirm that it followed NOP regulations. Then the other option would be to get a non-GMO project verified honey. There are quite a few available, and the list is growing. And then we also would get documentation to confirm this is if those two options aren't available. You can get documentation to confirm the bees' hives are free of commercially available GM crops within a 4-mile radius and compliant non-forage feed. So this can be a good pathway if it's from a country where GM crops are not allowed. If it's less than 5% organic, this certificate is sufficient. Certificate in summary. If it's less than 0.5%, then it can be exempt.
For True North, again, if it's greater than 0.9 and that honey is certified organic or non-GMO project verified or certified to another non-GMO IP, then we would just need the certificate and summary list. Otherwise, we would need documentation to confirm that the bees come from hives free of commercial available GM crops, but within, like I said earlier, within that 1.8-mile radius. And we would still assess the non-forage feed. Sometimes beekeepers will do supplemental feeding of like a cane sugar and water mixture or even a corn syrup and water mixture. So we would need to look at all the supplemental feed.
Then our last category here is high-risk oils, so soybean oil or canola oil. So if it's greater than 5%, then it needs to be non-GMO project verified, or there has to be a sampling and testing plan in place for a sample that has sufficient intact DNA. So crude oil or the actual soybeans or canola have to be tested. Again, non-GMO project verified ingredients, you just need the summary and certificate. There are quite a few options available. And if it's less than 5%, then again, you can get documentation to show it comes from a system designed to avoid GMOs, like an organic certificate or other non-GMO IP program, Eurofin, genetic ID, SGS supply chain, etc.
And for True North, again, if it's greater than 0.9, certified organic or another non-GMO IP. Otherwise, if it's if it's more than 0.9 and not certified, then we would need some options would include sampling or testing, country of origin determination would be some additional options.
Okay, great. So I know we're here at the end of the hour, so we'd like to just now open it up to you guys. If you have specific questions that we can help out with, we can have a few more minutes to go with that.